Welcome. So have we got any printmaking students? Yeah. Book arts. Yeah, and then fine art digital. Mine up there. Good. So welcome. We don't normally do this in here. So we've changed the layout to try and squeeze us all in here. These lectures will normally be in the lecture theatre, and certainly from next week they will be. I am recording this as well, and the lectures in this term will also be recorded. That, if you were at the welcome event last week, that's the same kind of short link to remind you how to get there. And the welcome event talk is listed already there, so you can watch that. And I've also put all the links that I mentioned during that talk and we looked at are all in the description of the YouTube video there as well. I know some of you are still writing that down. I think it has been sent out. I've emailed it to all my students. I've sent it through to the course leaders elsewhere, but if you haven't got it in email, remind your course leader because they have got it, this link, so they can send it to you as well. You won't find it on YouTube if you search. It's unlisted. So it is actually just for you, MA students only. For those of you, just a reminder, those of you who have English as an additional language, there's language development sessions which start Friday this week. Can you all see the screen, by the way? Is it okay, Jums? It's clear? Yeah. It's in the MA Illustration Studio, which is in B block. So where the canteen is, that's B block. It's on the third floor of that block, and you'll find the language development sessions there on Fridays. Now, that'll run right through the term, but they start this week. So there's a lot to cover today, and I want to have a bit more elements of discussion as part of this as well. So it's not just you listening. I know we've set this up in rows, but it was more just a practical thing, but we will get you all talking as well. The series of talks that will happen this term are specifically focused on practice-based research methods and methodologies for artists and designers, and that's across the MA programme here. I'm going to just talk about art and artists because that's pretty much where we're all coming from, this particular group of 3 courses. It's going to come out from lots of different directions. So it's going to be, today we're going to look at some theories and have a little bit more kind of investigation on that and thinking about why it's important and what are some of the, I'm going to suggest one particular methodology which you might want to use. Other weeks there'll be, next week for example, we've got, no problem coming. We've got David Cross coming, who's very entertaining and very political and he's always very energetic and angry and gets people wound up and thinking about big questions and big challenges and big problems, and he explores that through his art practice as well. So a lot of it will be looking at his art practice and you'll be kind of seeing how he uses research methodologies within his practice. So there'll be different angles. We've got a professor of fine art coming as well as part of it. So there'll be different approaches and different ways of thinking about it. So today is more kind of an introduction and thinking about one particular methodology and thinking about some of the aspects of that, which I hope will be useful for you. The first thing to say is we talk about research methods and methodologies, and I'll come back to this again later, but just to be very clear, the methodology is the big, broad approach. The methods are the actual tools you use on a kind of specific step-by-step basis. So although the language can be a little bit fuzzy and confusing sometimes, you might hear it used in different ways in different settings, and often we talk about process with art in particular. Methodology is the broad general idea, often a concept, often a kind of theory, and then the methods are the steps that you use to get there. Today I'm actually going to talk specifically about action research, is the one that we're going to talk about, which is something which comes from broadly from sociology originally, but it's a particularly useful methodology for artists, I would argue. And we'll go for that into a bit of theory. But first, a question. What's the first thing that comes into your mind when you hear the word research? Reading. Finding. Taking pictures. Experimenting. Library. Refined.
Museum.
Yeah. Museum. Anything else? Signs. Okay. Anything else? This is the first thing that comes into your head when you think about it. Artists. Collective. Collecting. Yeah. How about, what's the first thing that comes in your mind when you hear the word researcher? Explorer. Academic. There's no right or wrong answers. Scientist, yeah. Librarian, okay. Experimenter, yeah. What do they look like? Wear glasses. White coat. Or padded sleeves, padded elbows, that type of thing. Maybe. Does anybody, when you saw that, did anybody think me? One person's nodding, yeah. Most people don't, but you are. You do research and you are researchers. That's kind of the point of doing a master's. So yes, it is all the things that you've mentioned there, but it's also actually you. This is what you are becoming anyway. And as artists, hopefully what you'll see is that the process of making art is very much connected with research. It's a kind of a natural, it's a really natural fit. I don't see it as a particular challenge or problem. All you're being asked to do at master's level is maybe do it a little bit more deliberately, a little bit more consciously than maybe you've done it before. But it fits very comfortably to the normal process, I would argue. Another question, and this one I want you to do it in, I'm going to give you 4 minutes. I'm going to present a problem for you, and I want you to come up with a research solution for this problem in 4 minutes. And I want you to do it in groups of about 3 people, maybe 4 people maximum, but ideally kind of just 3 people, just people around you. This is the question. How would you research the impact of eating fruit on a group of 100 children living in an economically disadvantaged community in London? So you've got 100 children, they're economically disadvantaged, and you want to research the impact of eating fruit. You have 4 minutes to come up with a plan in groups of 3. There's no right or wrong answer, I just want to know what you might come up with. It's a tough task in a short period of time, isn't it? It's a bit mean, but there's a reason for asking this. So what are some of your plans? How are you going to go about this? Anybody want to share approach? Okay, so this group here first, yeah?
We thought we might define the terms a bit more closely.
Yeah. So what are some of the loose terms in this?
Community.
Yeah.
Fruit.
Yep.
How much, how often.
Yeah.
What does impact, psychological impact, sociological, educational.
Yeah.
Economically disadvantaged, how economically disadvantaged.
Yeah. So you can see straight away from just that, there is a huge amount which needs to be defined and questioned within a fairly loose statement. You know, it's designed to be a loose statement. You'd never that wouldn't be your research question at all. Of course it wouldn't. But it was partly there like that to try and hopefully you get exactly that answer. But you can see there's lots of things you have to question almost everything within that. The statements in there, so you have to define those terms, what it is you're doing. So that's great, thank you. Anybody kind of gone a bit further? What might you go about it? So something here.
I think you might then need to set up what the base data is. What's your starting point? Because how can you work out what changes there are? And then set up a way of actually making those changes. And then measuring the change, recording it, and then perhaps testing, doing it again to validate it, and maybe then publishing it.
Yeah, precisely. So by introducing a number into this, I've pushed you to start to thinking in terms of numbers. Start thinking, okay, so is there a way to measure this, and how do you measure this? And different ways of quantifying that. But we'll come back to that a little bit more. That's really helpful. Thank you. Anything else? There was a group, you were going to say something there, weren't you?
You had a disagreement in that group about
Good.
ethics.
That's really good.
Because you might have to deny some children fruit.
Interesting.
You can't do that.
Absolutely.
There's another problem with
Yeah.
the method that you apply. We thought it would be good to use the schools, so you can have somebody in authority checking that the children are eating the fruit. There's also the problem that children don't like fruit. Often.
So many things in that, aren't there? Yeah. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, it's kind of like as if you do it in different school, you won't be sure if it's the fruit or maybe the teacher.
So there's a lot of ethical questions which come into this, and particularly so like one way of looking at it is you've got 100 children, you have 50 over here, you don't give them any fruit for 6 months. This 50 you give fruit and see what happens. But you could never ever be allowed to do that, because there's the danger that you might be actually harming somebody, and you just can't do that. It would just be unethical. It would never pass an ethics committee. It's immoral. You couldn't do that. And then you've got the extra dimension that what is actually your influence here? What even if you did set up an experiment, what is actually influencing their eating of fruit, or it might be the colour of it, or the influence of a teacher, or how do you get these kind of exact samples which might be the same? Yeah. So it's really good that those ethical questions came out. Anybody else got any comments?
You wouldn't necessarily actually have to change their lifestyle at all. You could just measure how much fruit they were consuming, and then look at the impacts of those that had more fruit on average than others, and then control for other factors like economics and social status.
So there are ways to be less crude than the kind of 50 here, starve. What happens if nobody eats for 50 people don't eat for 6 months, and guess what, they die. It's kind of fairly, but you don't have to be as crude as that. There could be more subtle intervention, like you're suggesting there. Yeah. Anything else?
I certainly lied about the amount of fruit I ate as a child.
So there's really interesting things like that, isn't it? Because you're not dealing with something which can be very simply measured and quantified in a potentially reliable way, because there's lots of complicated variables that might be involved in it.
You can also look at existing studies as well.
Yeah, precisely. So really important to see what else has been done around any particular research you're doing, is trying to understand what else has been done around that subject. Don't reinvent the wheel. Kind of read around the subject, understand it, and we'll contextualise that in terms of art later on. You going to say
I was
something?
just going to say, well, if you've got 100 children living in a disadvantaged community in London, it doesn't mean that all those 100 children are disadvantaged, so therefore you'd have to research their individual backgrounds, because other things might influence the data, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So it's even more complicated, which goes back to your original point of questioning everything in that statement and trying to understand all the terms in that. What does an economically disadvantaged area can have a huge diverse range of income levels just within that, and it kind of adds even more layers of complexity to this. Hopefully what you're seeing from this, it's not a trick question, because all of this is really, really good stuff that you've responded to with this. What you're seeing is that the kind of classic, kind of sometimes known as hard science, the kind of the research which is trying to be objective, trying to be removed from a situation, just doesn't function in lots and lots of situations, and in particular with art. And therefore that's one of the reasons why action research was developed as a way for within sociology and other humanities subjects around the 1930s, as a way to recognise that you can't, like if you were trying to understand the impact of fruit, you can't set it up with 50 children starving and 50 children being fed. You just couldn't do it. It's not going to help anybody. You're not really going to learn much from that either, as well as all the other complexities that we've looked at. Here's a quote, it's a slightly complicated quote, but hopefully it makes a point that I want to get to. One of the founding figures of action research, Kurt Lewin, in 1952, remarked that research which produced nothing but books was inadequate. The task, he quotes, these writers say, the task, as Marx suggests in his thesis on Feuerbach, is not merely the task of research, is not merely to understand and interpret the world, but to change it. Now, hopefully just pick up that last bit, don't worry about anything else, that hopefully what we're talking about here is research which changes things. Fundamentally, that is you and your art practice. But it has the potential to change other things as well beyond that. But it is about change. So what is action research? Well, fundamentally, it's about three things. It's not as simple as this, but it's just kind of three elements to it, which hopefully kind of gives you an overall picture of it. It's research into practice. So it's actually into the work that you do. Now, the point about action research is this can be used by social workers, it can be used by economists, it can be used by any profession, in effect. In your context, obviously, what you're thinking about all the time is you as the artist using it. So it's a research into your practice, what it is that you do, what it is you make in this particular context. And it's research by the practitioner. So it's recognising that you are the person who's doing it. So you're not trying to find this removed position from it. It's actually research by you in order to change and improve a given situation, or in this case, your art practice. What that means is that it's not like you can be removed from it. So action research said, as a researcher going into a situation dealing with, eating healthy food is something which people have researched many times. But because you can't make it into this kind of objective position where you can remove yourself completely from it, your presence in that situation changes it. As you said, the presence of the teacher might influence somebody in terms of whether they eat the fruit or not, for example. And action research recognises that it isn't a simple, clean-cut thing, that we are involved in the research, and that muddies the waters, you could say, but actually it's just real. That's just the way life is. And when it's your own art practice, it's very much like that. So it's research into your practice by you as the practitioner in order to change or improve. So it is this unique combination of action and research together. And it isn't trying to kind of separate these two things out. To say, action, my art making exists over here, my research is when I go to the library over there, and they're kind of completely separate things. It's actually fully integrated into you, and you are the one who holds these two things together. Some more thoughts which kind of open this up a little bit, and a few of the things I'm going to go through here. I'm just going to run through a series of things and get you to do another little exercise. Action research is often, and this is particularly important now for you as you're starting a master's course and thinking about your own art practice, it's often slightly more than you would normally do. As I hinted at the beginning, I think the process of being an artist, of making work, I think fits very comfortably with the process of research. But you are doing it now. We're asking you to do it on a master's course a little bit more deliberately and doing a little bit more than maybe you would do, so that you can be better at it in the future. And I'll come to that in a minute. Secondly, it raises questions. And what I mean by that is it doesn't necessarily start from a position of solving problems, which is often the way we think about research. Instead of being problem solving, it can be problem raising. So you're actually deliberately looking for challenges, you're looking for difficulties, looking for areas which can be improved. So you're finding the problems and looking for change and improvement in those things. And therefore it's often about raising questions as much as it is answering those questions. And that can get a little bit messy and a little bit confusing at times. We can sometimes see the world from the point of view of problems, that there's just a series of problems or pathologies which need to be solved, which need to be cured or sorted out. But actually, as an artist, we often sit in a place where we have to be comfortable with the problems. We have to be comfortable with the things which aren't quite working, maybe. Or we have to be comfortable with the questions and not necessarily always being able to answer those questions at this point. It may be that we can answer those questions at a future date. And then, as I've mentioned before, but just emphasise it is very much about improving and changing. So, 4 characteristics of this, and I'll take you through each of these because there's a little bit of detail related to each of these which will help. Maybe this gets down into more the kind of the way you actually go about this. So this isn't a kind of an absolute definition of it. A characteristic is just the flavour of the thing. And there may be others I could have picked. But when people talk about action research, they often talk about it with these particular 4 characteristics. And I'll go through them one by one. First one is cyclical, so there's a sense that it goes round and round and round. So it starts with a plan. It starts with your question, what it is that you're interested in exploring. And that language can be a little bit loose. So at the beginning of the course here, you're asked to write a project proposal, something which defines and raises some questions of what you want to explore and how you want to go about that over the next 2 years. So you have some kind of plan. You then act on that plan. You make something in response to that. You then observe what it is that you have made, that you've done, the action you've done. You then reflect on that and consider it, which is a little bit deeper than just the observation. You reflect on it to kind of question it and see what was going on, what worked, what didn't work, so that you can then plan again and move on. And the idea being that it potentially could be a kind of an ongoing cyclical thing. So you've been around it once, plan, act, observe, reflect. You then move on to a further question, which then means you then plan, act, observe, reflect. Now, that's all kind of nice and neat. It's often not like that, and researchers of researchers into action research and those who have actually used action research find that it's often not as kind of clean cut as these very clear, obvious 4 steps. But the point being, in this diagram, it's more like a spiral, but the spiral is moving upwards. So there's some sense of progression from it, not just a kind of going around and round and round in a circle and just going nowhere. There's some sense of movement to it, and that these steps are pushing you forward or pushing you up, or whichever direction you want to talk about. We will explore that slightly more in a minute. The second characteristic is collaborative. Now, collaboration is obvious, and we think that that's working with other people, and that kind of makes a lot of sense. And it is that, but I want to suggest that there's 2 ways. One is working with other people, and one is working with materials and the things that you actually use to make your work. So thinking about that as a collaboration, not just a kind of you are the master of your materials, it's actually you collaborating with your materials. But the first one with other people, let me just make a slight aside comment, but I think it's important, particularly at this beginning point of your masters. One of the challenges of doing a course, any kind of course within an academic setting, is the power of the university really sits in the university's ability to award you a qualification. That's actually where the power of the university exists. In stamping that bit of paper at the end of the 2 years to say, you are now a master's student, there you go, you have that. What that requires is for us to assess you as an individual against a set of criteria, against the learning outcomes, and therefore what we're doing is we're breaking you down into individual units and then assessing you and then awarding that assessment based on you as an individual. But that, to me, certainly, and many others, is counter to the very nature of the creative process. So there is a certain myth that the artist, the genius artist, is the individual sitting on their own, producing amazing work in utter isolation from everybody else around them. And 1, it's not true. 2, there is no evidence of this through history. Even the most apparently reclusive artist or creative practitioner, actually you start to find that they have remarkable connections and collaborations in the most subtle ways sometimes with other people. And actually I just think it's a bad thing to think I can do it all on my own, because you can't. None of us can. It's ridiculous. So the idea that we should be collaborating. But the challenge is in this setting is that we're viewing you as individuals and assessing you as individuals. And yet, fundamentally, I would say that collaboration is vital to creative practice. Now, what I'm not saying is that collaboration has to be as far as maybe I had 2 students on my course, the Fine Art Digital course, about 4 years ago, who had been friends from Spain. They'd been friends from about the age of 6. They weren't related, but they may as well have been twins. And they came on the course as a collaborative duo. This was their art practice. They worked together. They had a separate name for themselves, the 2 of them. There was no way to separate them. It was impossible to separate them. So we assessed them as a duo. It was the only way we could do it, because they were so integrated. And when I saw them working, it was literally... There's another famous artist who are actually twins called the Singh twins. Anybody come across the Singh twins? Really amazing artists based in Liverpool, who do these most incredible drawings, and had a fantastic exhibition about 9 months ago. literally bits of paper, and they are drawing on the paper together at the same time, and one is drawing a line and one is filling the line in, and this type of thing. And so that's an extreme form of collaboration where people are working so closely together that there's no longer any sense of individual identities. There is a collective identity by that 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever it is. That's collaboration. I'm not saying it has to be that far, but the fact that you would share your ideas with someone else, the fact that you would share your materials, your resources, the fact that you would say, actually, I don't know how to do this, but you do, can you help me with this? And then at some point, maybe you don't help that person, but maybe you're helping somebody else, and it's kind of this collective kind of contribution that's going on. That, I think, is really, really important, and is a vital part of action research. So don't get into, despite the fact this structure, this university pushes you as individuals, try and fight back against that. Stand back and stand against it and say, no, actually, we're together in this, and we can share this together and work collaboratively. So that's the second thing. And then the second part of that is collaborating with materials. So often we see materials as something to be mastered, that we are on top of it, we are in control of it. Actually, no, see it as something that you collaborate with, you work with your materials. I don't know if everybody does that, but if you do, I do that all the time with my work. It's much more releasing. I find it much more interesting. I'm more open to the surprise and the contingency and the confusion that happens with materials, because they do go and do things which, oh, I didn't expect that. I've worked with one particular material which I've worked for 20 years now, and it still surprises me, even though I think I know it really, really well. And that, I don't want to lose that. I really enjoy that kind of sense of surprise and contingency which you have to have with that. So collaboration is also with materials as well. By the way, if anything's not clear and you want to jump in, we will have a bit more discussion in a minute, but don't hesitate, don't wait to the end. You can just jump in and ask questions or disagree. Absolutely fine for you to disagree with me. I'm really up for that at any time. The third characteristic of action research is qualitative, not quantitative. Now, these are two key words related to research. Most scientific research, often kind of seen as this is what research is quantitative, as in it's about quantifying things, measuring things. It's usually about numbers based on what you can measure and what you can quantify, and therefore you can have some kind of calculations based on numbers. Qualitative is much more based on words and feelings and interpretations of situations. It's often seen as the soft research as opposed to hard research. I think that's a bit crude and a bit not particularly helpful, but it's often seen in that way. And qualitative is much more what action research is based on, and much more what your art research is based on as well. But again, I've got a quote later on which will hopefully open that up a little bit more as well. And then the fourth thing is reflective. And I wanted to spend a little bit more time on this because there's some really useful stuff, and this part is vital for your learning as well as on the course, as well as the process of research. Although I don't want to separate research and learning because it's all kind of bound in together at the same time. Reflective means that you are prepared to look critically at what it is you are doing and look for the challenges, the things which work well, the things which didn't work well, and find ways through those challenges and problems. I'm going to put up a quote now, which is quite complex, and we'll break it down a little bit. But it's from an educational researcher called Phil Race, who's particularly good. If any of you are involved in education or learning of any sort, Phil Race, all his research is at university level, but I think his principles are fantastic and can be used at any level. He says reflection could be argued to be the essential stage where learning is integrated within the whole learner and added to existing frames of reference and internalised and personalised. I'm going to break this down just to emphasise the different stages, so don't worry if you're writing it down, it's still there. So what he's arguing is that reflection is the essential stage. And Phil Race understands learning and education better than most people I've read. So if he says it's essential stage, I'm prepared to accept that this is really, really important. So he says it's the essential stage where learning is integrated with the whole learner. So that sense of it being integrated, it's kind of kind of bound into, it's woven into the learner. And then it's added to existing frames of reference. So who you already are, your belief systems, your understanding of the world, your influences, your upbringing, who you are, your frames of reference is then added to that. But at the end of it, this is really important. It's internalized and personalized. So it's not that learning is this kind of abstract thing which is there and then it can just be internalized. I just swallow it and I've got it. Or it can just be added to it. It's then internalized and personalized. So that learning, if that thing exists over here, floating around, will be different when it's internalized and personalized for me as it is for you. Because it's become part of who I am. And what he's saying is that reflection is the point, it's the trigger, is the process which makes that happen. Otherwise it remains just this kind of, this rather abstract thing which is almost like a pill which you could take, but actually it just comes out of you anyway, so it doesn't really have any long-term impact on you. Reflection is where it actually has this deep impact on you and changes you altogether. So a couple of thoughts on reflection. Firstly, it's not what you have done. So the obvious thing to think is I'm an artist and I'm making work and I'm doing sketches and I'm playing around with materials and I've got all this stuff and these tests and these experiments and ideas that have, photographs have been taken and films have been making and audio have been recording, and you think, yeah, I'm just going to reflect on that. I'm looking at those things. It's well, yes, that's the start point. You're looking at the stuff you have done, the actions that you have done. Yes, yeah, that's the start point. But I'd say it has to be much more than that. It isn't just, it's not what you've done, and this sounds a bit weird, okay, but go with this for a minute. Reflection is not what you've done. It's about who you are when you are doing it. Now that might sound a bit kind of introspective and a bit kind of woolly, but think about what's going on there. Instead of trying to kind of remove yourself from that, this is the stuff. Imagine in your studio and you've got all this stuff there. Okay, I'm going to look at this and this kind of try and make this objective position where I'm removed from it, and I'm going to observe it. I'm going to reflect on all of this. No, it's on who you were when you were doing it, and that's more challenging, more uncomfortable, because you've got to deal with your emotions. You've got to deal with your feelings. You've got to deal with your anger, with your frustration and the joy and the flow, and you've got to deal with all of that, because that's where the reflection really starts to get deep and starts to connect and starts to flow through you, and then you start to see how your work is developing and moving forward. The reality is that whatever you do, and particularly your art, can't be completely removed from who you are. And therefore, the reflective process is you questioning and looking at your beliefs, your feelings, your identity, your value systems, because that is going to be in the work and it's going to come out through the work, maybe in very subtle ways, but it's going to be there as part of what's going on. It takes a bit of time to do this. It's not something that's necessarily really easy to do. It's almost like a way of working which takes some effort. It's like training, if you want to run a 5k race, 5 kilometre race, you can't just, most people just can't just get up and run 5 kilometres. You kind of train to it, you build up to it, you run for 3 minutes and you collapse, and then you crawl home, and the next day you run 5 minutes, and then maybe you run 5 minutes and you walk, and then you run 3 minutes, and you build it up gradually so that you can then do this. And this is what the reflective process is like. You kind of gradually then build it up. It also tries to encapsulate change. I've talked about change lots of times, and this is vital to the action research process. You're looking for change, you're looking for improvement. And it's actually trying to encapsulate, reflection is trying to encapsulate where change happens. Because your work changes as you develop. You've all come on this course with an art practice, but you're seeking to develop that and push that further. Therefore, there'll be change. You want to see that change. So reflection is trying to encapsulate that and trying to see, well, where did it happen? Where did the change take place? What was the pivotal moment? When did it start to occur? When did it speed up or slow down? So reflection is investigating and interrogating these processes so that when you look back, you can see that change happened quite quickly because of this, this, and this, and you can see the context around it. It might be as simple as it was warm in the studio. So don't be afraid of the really basic things. It was warm, and therefore I felt more comfortable and I was able to do work more easily. Whereas when you're freezing cold in the studio, it's genuinely hard to make work. It's quite cold in here, isn't it? Because the heating hasn't come on yet. Or it might be as simple as time of day. I've learned for myself that I know that, like, when I have to do any kind of writing or academic writing, or even preparing talks like this, I know that I cannot do this in the morning. My brain just doesn't function in this way. When I'm writing academic papers, for me it's really 10 o'clock at night till about 3 o'clock in the morning. That's where things really flow. And I know I can get stuff done at that point. So if I have a deadline of midday, I know that I can't finish it on the morning of that day. It's got to be done in the middle of the night. And I've just learned that about myself. And so it can be really practical things like that. And I kind of know what can holds me back and what makes it really slow, what stops me from actually making work. The reality is, for most of us, if we're honest, deadlines make us make work because we can procrastinate too easily otherwise. But also, what other things are going on around it? What motivates us? What's exciting us in the work and the practice? And therefore, what's pushing things forward? Why do things slow down? Avoid those. Once you know those things, you can avoid those situations and go for the situations which speed things up. So, a very quick look at 4 characteristics: cyclical, collaborative, qualitative, and reflective. So, a little exercise. So I'm going to leave those up in the corner there in the thing, and I want you to initially take a couple of minutes to answer some questions, but silently on your own. But if you've got some way of writing stuff down, I would write things down. An important part, I'm not going to go into it in any great detail now, but an important part of the reflective process is actually writing words, which actually sometimes can be quite uncomfortable for us as artists because we work with images generally. But pushing yourself into a place where you write can often be very, very helpful for artists because it pushes us into a place which is uncomfortable, and we have to think in a different way by the process of writing, which can be very, very helpful for looking back at the making process that involved it. So I would encourage you to write some things down in these next few minutes. But I'm going to put, I think there's 4 questions or so up here that I want you to think about. Initially, just silently on your own, and then I'll ask you to share it with other people. So the first question is, what do you make? It sounds really simple, but in terms of your art, I mean here, not, I'll make breakfast. That may be correct, but what do you make in terms of your art? What is it that you make? Stop and think about, what is it do I make? And it sounds very simple, but it might be a little bit harder than you think. Then ask yourself this question: in what ways do you want to change or improve what you make? Particularly as you are in week 2 of this MA course, that's a really important question to start thinking about what it is you want to change or improve. And then the third question is, plan what you will do next in light of the characteristics of action research. I'm not telling you that you all need to use action research as this overall methodology. I'm just suggesting it's quite a useful framework. One of the beauties about action research is it's a very loose framework, and we'll come to look at some methods in a minute. But it's because it's such a loose framework, it's quite a handy one to use because you can do almost anything underneath it. That's one of the advantages of it. So the third question is, plan what you are going to do in light of these characteristics. So thinking about the cyclical, the collaborative, the qualitative, and the reflective characteristics of this. What might you do? So time is moving quickly. Wow, time is moving very quickly. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to think about your future in 3 minutes. It's a bit mean, isn't it? Start at the beginning, see how far you get. But you've got 3 minutes. I'm sorry to do this, but that's the time. Save that and we'll use it again at the end of the talk. It's worth thinking through this though, it's worth asking these kind of questions for yourself in the future. I'm going to jump through a big chunk of stuff here. So I'm going to jump to here. If you're feeling a bit confused by all this, don't worry. The reality is a research process, and particularly for artists, I would say it is messy. And there's actually nothing necessarily wrong with that. The thing is, with action research, what you tend, if you do any reading around the subject, what you'll find is, like the diagram I showed you before, you'll see that type of diagram and these type of diagrams where everything is kind of very neat and kind of symmetrical, and it all kind of, there's always this kind of nice sense of progression and kind of getting better and better, or even, look, that's got growth through the centre of it, you know, and all the kind of very dramatic arrows moving upwards, and this one's actually turning down, but at least there's some kind of some movement to it. Or this one, look at that, you know, continual progress is this kind of big arrow that goes through the centre of it. The reality is it will probably look a bit like that. And that's okay. I've never seen it. It certainly doesn't work for me in this kind of like beautiful, simple thing. Those things are just useful to kind of understand, okay, there was a series of steps, and if I get lost, I can go back to one of those steps. The reality is it will probably look like this. However, this still has some sense of something going on, even this little sketch here. You know, whether it's exploding out or coming in, you don't know. Someone's tried to put some marks together, try and find some kind of gathering together, maybe put some boundaries on a few things as well. But stuff is kind of broken out, and there's some spirals happening over there. And so it is a messy process, but there's a kind of, as you go through it, and particularly as you look back on it over your time on the course, you'll begin to see patterns emerge, and you'll begin to see things and realise, oh, that's who I am. That's the way that I work. I didn't quite realise it was that. I thought I was that, but I wasn't quite sure. And reflection is like holding up an amazing mirror to yourself and realising, oh, yeah. When I was about a teenager, I needed glasses, and you had those dreadful, those of you older in the UK citizens will remember the old NHS glasses you used to get. And they were horrible things, and if you wore those at school, you were kind of bullied mercilessly, you know. So I would never wear these glasses, and I would just sit next to my mate and write down from his book whatever he wrote on the board. And I went to the opticians, and my parents said, "Fine, look, you've got to go and get some proper glasses." And I remember sitting in the opticians, and they put these, I was 15 or something like that, put these glasses on, and I thought, wow, who is that? I was covered in spots. Wow, I didn't realise I looked so ugly, you know, because I'd seen myself in this blurred life for all these years. And it's a bit like that, you kind of reflect and think, oh really? Oh, that's who I am. Not necessarily ugly, that's probably a very bad metaphor, isn't it? But you see yourself in a fresh way, you see yourself and realise, oh, that's who I am, that's the way that I make work. I do want to highlight one particular extra bit, because I think there's so much in this, and this, I think, is one of the most powerful bits of this. So there's a guy called Donald Shern. Has anybody seen this book or read this book, Reflective Practitioner? Anybody? 1983, I think it is. I think I've got it written down somewhere. 1983, yeah. And he's an amazing book. It is not about artists. It's about any professional in any category. And if you're interested at all, go and get the book and read it. But it's quite a dense, quite a long, complex book. So, I'm going to highlight two particular things, right? But this first one is really important. He makes a distinction between reflection on action, which is after the event thinking. So you've done something, and then you look back at it, and you reflect on that from the time after you've done the thing. He makes a big distinction between that and what he calls reflection in action, which is more the kind of thinking while doing, the kind of thinking on your feet process. And the point that he makes with this, and he's talking about any work scenario, any kind of professional, and I've got a great quote which kind of opens this up in a minute from him, and I think it's very, very relevant for us as artists as well, is the reflection on action. So the kind of doing something, making a painting, making a video, doing a print, shaping a bit of clay, writing a bit of code, whatever it is, the reflecting on that afterwards strengthens your ability to reflect in action. And the reflection in action is where you really develop the mastery, where you develop the professional. He calls it how professionals think in action. So he's very much talking the difference between someone who's an amateur or a beginner or something and someone who becomes a professional. He's not necessarily just someone who's paid for it, but someone who is a master, is highly skilled, has great ability in a particular area. So you're in a situation, you're making something, and you've used some new ink, and it's not quite working the way you expect it to do, and you're not quite sure what to do next. The ability to reflect in that moment and to bring in all of your experience and understanding into that moment and know exactly what to do, that comes because you've done the reflection on action in other situations. So you then have that ability to reflect in action. And it literally, in a situation where you don't know what to do, you know exactly what to do. Not because you've ever been in that situation before. Not that you've ever learned that in this situation you do this, this, this and this, and then I've solved it. No, it's not like that. You're always in these situations which are messy, confusing. The ground is moving, you're not quite sure. You bring all that experience into that moment and you know exactly what to do. So it's so simple in many ways, but it's so powerful. So the choice to deliberately reflect on what you're doing strengthens your ability to reflect in action in the future. He says this, and I've got a quote. Now he uses male personal pronouns, and I'll change that in a minute, but I'll leave it as his original quote in this first slide. The practitioner allows himself to experience surprise, puzzlement, or confusion in a situation which he finds uncertain or unique. He reflects on the phenomenon before him and on the prior understanding which has been implicit in his behaviour. He carries out an experiment which serves to generate both a new understanding of the phenomenon and a change in the situation. And I'm just going to break that down into 3 parts because there's a lot in that. Very, very powerful. The practitioner, and I've de-generalised the personal pronouns. So the practitioner allows himself to experience surprise, puzzlement or confusion in a situation which they find uncertain or unique. So there's an action by you as the artist. So let's personalise it to us. It's we allow ourselves deliberately to be in places of surprise, puzzlement or confusion by looking for situations which are uncertain or unique. That's a choice we have. And what he's saying is that to learn, to develop in your craft, in your ability, in the area where your art, basically, in this case, or any profession he's doing, is you deliberately choose that. You choose those situations. You go looking for those situations. Sorry, I didn't put that up, did I, that first bit there? The practitioner allows themselves to experience surprise, puzzlement or confusion in a situation which they find uncertain or unique. They reflect on the phenomenon before them and on the prior understanding which has been implicit in their behaviour. And this is absolutely crucial because there's so much of our behaviour, as in everything we do, in particular in our art, there's so much of our behaviour which is implicit. It's built into us. And often that's just the way we do things, and that's just the way it always has been. The reflective process is where you can then question that. You can look at that, you can observe it, you can notice it, and then say, well, actually, that bit of behaviour doesn't really help. I need to change that. Or maybe I just need to adjust it. Or that bit, when I do that, that really works, that really helps. Therefore, I'm going to emphasise that. I'm going to work in that way in particular. So it's very powerful as you start to look and you realise that you reveal to yourself the implicit behaviours and actions which we continually do. And then the final part, they carry out an experiment which serves to generate both a new understanding of the phenomenon and a change in the situation. So by having gone through the first, by looking for those places of puzzlement and confusion and something unique, and then actually reflecting on it so you become more aware of what's going on, then you set up another, which is basically the plan, reflect, the plan, act, observe, reflect process coming out. You then say, right, okay, I'm going to do something different now. And this time I'm going to do it, and it's going to generate new understanding and a change in the situation. So I'm not just going round and round in a circle. I've now moved on, or I've spiralled up, or I've spun out of control, or whatever it is. But you've changed, something has moved on into a different situation. Does that make sense? Has anyone come across that before? Out of interest? No. Remarkably simple, but very powerful if you give it time. If you're actually prepared to kind of commit to that and say, I'm going to look at myself and my work in this way, it is very, very powerful. One other aspect he says, and this is, language starts to get a little bit confused in the way he used it, but there's a bit of this language which is very comforting for us. So we'll get there in a second. He makes a contrast between what he calls technical rationality, which is the kind of the imposition of the problems are solvable through the rigorous application of science. That's the kind of the assumption in many situations. There's something wrong, or there's something which needs to change. Therefore, I'm going to find what the protocol is, what the procedure is, and then I'm going to rigorously apply that, and something will change and move forward. And he makes a contrast, and he says that's an approach, but it's not a particularly effective or transformatory approach. Instead, the language he talks about is professional artistry, which is very comforting for us. He's not actually talking just about artists, he's talking about anybody, but he uses this term, professional artistry, which is what he talks about in terms of reflection in action, so that you're actually doing it in the process of doing it, and that it's more intuitive practice. So it's a more intuitive practice instead of protocols that, okay, in this situation, what do? I need to do this, this, and this to get out, or to solve it, or to move forward. No, it's more intuitive. It's a little bit messier sometimes. And so he talks about this idea of professional artistry as a way to develop a professionalism and a mastery in a particular work situation. In our case, in our art making. Now, except Kearney is widely accepted, and his ideas are really, really crucial. I hope that if I was in an accident and I end up in accident and emergency in hospital, I would hope that they would follow protocols. I would hope that they wouldn't just kind of say, well, for fun, let's try it this way today, and try something different. I hope so. There were certain circumstances where you do want protocols. So I'm not kind of dissing all of that whole way of approaching the world. But for us within art, yes, there may be sometimes there are things like that, and certainly sometimes there are safety issues with the work that we're doing sometimes where we have to be careful. Particularly if you're using materials which may be a little bit dangerous, you have to use certain protocols with that. But generally, it's a more intuitive process that we're involved in. He says this: professional practice is complex, unpredictable, and messy. There's that word again. In order to cope, professionals have to be able to do more than follow set procedures. They draw on both practical experience and theory as they think on their feet and improvise. Anybody done any theatre work? Anyone doing any theatre improvisation? You done any improvisation? Yeah.
Yeah.
And a bit at the back there. Improvisation is not making it up on the spot, is it? Improvisation is hard work. You have to. Someone like Mike Leigh, who's a great British film director, who all his films are kind of improvised. But he gets the characters together, the actors together, and they spend months working through becoming those characters. So there isn't a script; they become those characters. So therefore, they are completely authentic when they speak or act or do. They're doing it in a way which is authentic to those characters. Improvisation is really hard work. You put in a huge amount of effort so that you can then make it up in that moment. And that's what he's talking about in these situations. He's talking about the professional here. They act both intuitively and creatively. Both reflection in and on action allows them to revise, modify, and refine their expertise. So that's quite comforting that he's talking in those terms. He's not talking specifically about artists, but it's very comforting for us that this is the way he thinks we develop our skills. And in particular, I think we can relate this to us as artists. One element of this, which I think is really important, is that on this course you have to keep a reflective journal. That is a vital part of the course. When it comes to your assessment, you will submit your work, but you will also submit a reflective journal, which is the documentation showing this process, this reflective process through the time on the course. And this is bound into your research, it's bound into you developing your work, and it's absolutely crucial for the course. Fine art digital students have to do it in the form of a blog. I haven't got time to go into that right now, but I'm absolutely 100% convinced that blogs are an unbelievably powerful tool for this process. So those of you who are printmaking and book arts, it's worth doing. But we haven't got time to go into the specifics of why that is so effective.
Sorry, just quickly, are you saying it's worth doing a blog as opposed to a written journal? That there's something different about the process?
It's the combination of the two which is the really powerful thing. So what? Okay.
Sorry.
It's a bit of a side, and I could talk at length about this, and I've done some research which backs this up as well. So, what I would say is that keeping a blog. Okay, let's take a very practical thing. You're writing some notes right now from this talk. You've got some notes, and there's a kind of a writing in the moment, or maybe you've done some work in the printmaking workshop, and then you write some notes. You write some quick notes to say what you did and describe what you did. That is reflection. That's good. But it's not very deep reflection. It's fairly shallow. What's required really is to go one step further and to ask yourself further questions, usually the next day, or certainly later that day. Not much longer than a day later, because otherwise you start to forget. But you start asking yourself some deeper questions. And therefore, what I've found is that the process for artists of the stuff that's in the studio, the notes, the sketches, the little bits of stuff that's just kind of lying around, the process of having to keep a blog forces you to say, okay, well, what's really important in this? I've done all these tests, but if I photograph that, and that, and put that on the blog and write some notes about it, that pushes you into a deep reflective process just by doing that. Because you're looking at all the stuff and you're having to self-edit. And you're having to curate, you're having to look at it and consider what is important. So the very fact of keeping a blog forces a second level, which pushes you into a deeper place. That's only the beginning though. The blog itself is like your brain on steroids. It is unbelievably powerful. Because if you're anything like me, when I did my masters, it was kind of loads and loads of sketchbooks and notebooks and all that kind of stuff. And when it came to the assessment, you had to kind of go through them all and annotate them and put little sticky notes on and stuff like that. I wheeled a suitcase in with them all in for my assessments, and boom, there you go, you know, there's all my journals. It was great. I loved those 2 weeks of going through and kind of working through it. It was fantastic. I'd forgotten most of the stuff that was in there. If I'd known it 6 months earlier, if I'd remembered it, it would have helped me. But I only remembered it at the end when it came to the assessment. The blog, by using the blog, what it does, it starts to make connections for you. Not to begin with, but as the more you use it, it starts to make connections for you. And by using the categories and the tags, but we won't go into the technical stuff, but as you start to use it, you start to think, oh, why is that word repeating again and again? Because it's in my tag cloud. You click on it, oh yeah, look, I wrote about that 6 months ago, I wrote about it 3 weeks ago, I wrote about it yesterday, and look how it connects. And it starts to make these connections which go beyond something which is just something which is linear written down on a piece of paper, which then means you've got to review it all the time. So those are two very simple reasons why keeping a blog is very, very powerful. Anyway, the point is you have to have a reflective journal. However you do it, you have to have a reflective journal. And blogs do not need to be technically complicated at all. Literally, you can set up a blog in 20 seconds, and I've done it. WordPress.com, choose a name, click, 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 bang, it's there. You've got the blog in 20 seconds. But the point is that what the reflective journal is doing is it's keeping a record of your actions, decisions, thought processes, the successes and the failures of what you might perceive as failures, and the issues that you are dealing with. Don't hide away from the very process. Don't feel the reflective journal is only presented the finished piece of work. It's meaningless without the process leading up to it, because it's meaningless to you because you know all that process. So share it with us, the staff, share it with each other, because it reveals the process. And actually it's a very powerful thing to do anyway. I could tell you many stories about how powerful just revealing that process is. But crucially for you as a learning process, it's absolutely vital and you do have to do it. That's a whole other separate talk, and certainly my students, Fine Art Digital, we'll be going through some of this on Tuesday. Be warned, we'll be talking a lot about blogs. So when it comes to the idea of methods and methodologies, so action research is this broad kind of overall methodology. What are some of the methods that could be used underneath this? And these are some methods that are used in different social science kind of contexts, but you can sometimes adapt these into art practice. The first thing is really simple, is making your work. That is a method. So if you paint, doing a painting, that is a method within your research. In this overall methodology of action research, a method is to actually sit down and do a painting. If you screen print, it is to do a screen print. If you make a video, it's making your work is one of the methods. So it doesn't have to be more complicated than this. But within that, there's lots of different things that could be used. Audio, photographic, video records. All of these are really important. For example, we can prove now that young babies can recognise their mother's voice more than anybody else. Partly that is proved because of video. You're looking a bit surprised, some of you. Because prior to that, to record enough evidence to do it, you'd have to use film, which was very expensive and took a lot of time, and then processing. When you can then record video, and you can record hours and hours and hours of video, you can show how this repeated behaviour happens. So a very, very young baby can respond to a mother's voice rather than anybody else's voice. So you can then capture it. So suddenly video became this really powerful research tool because you could do it and it was cheap. It was cheap to do. That was the other crucial thing. So don't forget, just photographing, audio recordings, video recordings of you making your work. If you're in a complicated process, particularly if you're doing something like etching, which has a series of fixed steps which you have to follow, don't wait till the end. Photograph it as you go through. Most people have a smartphone. Most people have an incredibly powerful research tool in your pocket right now. Pull it out, take a photograph. So you've got a record that was that step. Not just so you can remember how to do it next time, that's also really useful, but so that you're reflecting on that process So that when something goes wrong, or you want to, well, what if I try something slightly different? Then you're in that position to be able to do that. Case studies, which is often a kind of in the third term of this first year, you'll be briefed on doing your research paper, and a lot of you will probably use case studies, looking at it, because for the research paper, you're not allowed to write about your own practice, you write about the context of your practice. So case studies is a quite powerful thing, where you're looking at somebody else's work, and looking at the way they make work and their processes. So case studies can be a very powerful tool for research. Diaries, journals, logs, we've talked about that. Field notes, this is used a lot in social sciences. And how do you translate field notes into an art and design context? I guess it is that thing of taking photographs as you're going through an etching process. You know, that's a field. So it's a note from the actual moment of time when you are doing something, rather than just the kind of the distance, which gives a different feel to it. That's fundamentally what a field note is. Interaction analysis is a quite powerful tool. Now, how would you relate that? Well, you know, if you're an artist where you're dealing with interaction, then of course that is a vital part of it. If you're actually making work which is interactive, that's a vital part. But even if you've got a single image and you're putting it on the wall in an exhibition setting, watching how people respond to it, kind of just hanging around, particularly if they don't know that you are the artist, and you're just kind of looking, but actually you're looking, where are they looking at? What's drawing their eye into this image? Or if there's a series of images, you know, why is everybody ignoring mine? Well, the fact yours is white on a white wall, maybe that's why they've ignored it. You know, but you begin to observe, you're analysing the actual interaction which is going on. Interviews is a powerful tool. This is primary research and interview. We'll talk more about this another time, but actually talking directly to somebody. If there's an artist you really like their work, try and get an interview. Now, by interview, it doesn't have to be that you sit down with them for an hour and have it might be 2 questions on email, or even just anyone know Lev Manovich? He's a really interesting research. It's like a superstar researcher in particular areas. One of my students got a thumbs up from him on a comment she made on Facebook with him. So she quoted it in a research paper, a thumbs up, because she got a thumbs up from Lev Manovich. You know, yeah, it doesn't sound much, but in effect that's a primary bit of research. In that he read what she said, a statement she said, gave and put a thumbs up. That's a yes. That's a reply. That's an interview. It's hardly an interview, but you know what I mean. You're getting something back from this person, you know, in that context. Interviews are a powerful thing when it comes to the research paper, but also they're very useful for kind of finding out information as you're going along, particularly if there's artists or processes which you think are interesting. Find out how they go about it. Participant and non-participant observation. This is crucial in a social sciences context. And you can define lots of different groups, but particularly two groups of people. So the participants, and you observe them, and then non-participants and how they observe the situation. How do you relate that into art? I guess in terms of your art, you are the main participant because you are the maker, you are making it. But then maybe that another participant, maybe someone who's invited to view your work, or if you're making a book, how do they actually interact with a physical thing which you're allowed to touch and move and change? So there could be other ways that you could define that participant, non-participant observation. Questionnaires is a kind of well-known classic thing. Questionnaires can sometimes provide you with data, as in quantitative data, as in kind of numbers. You know, 50 people said this, 25 people said that. You know, that type of thing. But often they can be a lot more interesting where you use it as a structure to ask the same question to different people. And you're interpreting their answers because it's more about the words and the language they're using. But by having a fixed set of questions, at least that's giving you a certain kind of structure to go back to each time, which can be useful. Although you can do semi-structured questionnaires and you can do non-structured as well. So there's a lot of freedom with action research with some of the methods that go on. One more thing. I don't want to oversimplify the difference between science and art here, but so I know there's a couple of scientists in the room, or people from a strong science background. However, you could argue that a science experiment leads to no change, either in the researcher or the world. The idea being that the science experiment needs to be reproducible. So if I'm setting up an experiment here, the proof that it is correct is that someone else over there can also recreate that same experiment. Therefore, I'm not changed, the world is not changed by this action because it can be repeated elsewhere. Now, that's it's slightly crude and a slightly simplistic way of looking at it, because, of course, that action may change many different things. But the point I'm making here is the difference between an art experiment, art or design experiment, is that it does lead to change. And this is a word that's come up again and again so far through this talk. And it's a change not just in the artist, but actually in the artist's world, and then potentially in the world beyond that as well. So it isn't that you can kind of just reproduce the same thing, or someone else could reproduce the same thing, because it's so personal and so individual. Here's a quote which kind of captures that a little bit. But the artist, if asked whether an art piece could be remade with identical results, would have to answer no, or it wouldn't be art. In making a piece of art, both the artist and the artist's world are changed, and re-asking the same question, facing the next blank canvas, will always yield a different answer. There is a moment for each artist in which a particular truth can be found, and if it is not found then, it will not ever be found, which is a powerful thing, isn't it, when you think about it. Because change, it happens. You can't go back to anything prior to that. So the powerful thing is that you are about to embark, and you are doing already in your art practice, but we're asking you to do it a little bit more deliberate over the next 2 years. You're embarking on a process which is discovering stuff, which if you don't find this, if you don't make your art, the world will be poorer because of that, because it won't ever exist. That's the potential situation we're putting ourselves in. To me, that's quite invigorating, quite exciting, maybe a little bit daunting as well. But it kind of gives a reason to say, yeah, I can do this. This is valuable. This is making a contribution. This is adding something to the world. You could question how much its value against something else, but I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. It is of itself. It is you are changing. Your world is changing, and potentially the world, the rest of the world around you, is changing because of what you are doing. You could look at, for example, none of us could write Hamlet. Not because we're not Shakespeare, it's because it's already been done. So we can't go back to a pre-Hamlet day. It doesn't exist. The world has changed because Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, and we can't redo that. We can't go back to that moment. You could also argue that it's a lot of what we produce, and particularly artists, is what's known as unfalsifiable. So the traditional idea is a hypothesis, an idea, a thought is falsifiable. You can test it to say it is true or it is false. But actually what we are making as artists is unfalsifiable by its very nature, because it's something which is about us and the process we're involved in, and therefore it isn't this kind of science type experiment. It's about change in us and the world. And then finally it's about, leave the biggest words to the very end, phenomenology and hermeneutics. And we haven't got time to go into it in a lot of detail. But phenomenology, the sense that there's a phenomena, there is something, the world is made of stuff, and we experience objects, we experience things by some kind of interaction with those things. It's about consciousness exists around the stuff, the things that we engage with. And that's a kind of a reality. That's what's going on. We are engaging with our materials, making art, and that is a powerful thing to do. And hermeneutics just simply means interpretation. It specifically means interpretation around a biblical text, but you can also use it broadly in just a sense of it can be interpreted in particular ways. The beauty of something like the biblical text is it isn't a set of laws and rules. We think religious texts often are, but the Christian Bible isn't actually, a very tiny amount of it is. It's mostly complex and messy and confusing stories which are to be interpreted, and therefore hermeneutics developed as a way to actually do that. That fits very comfortably with us as artists. That our work is something which is not a set of rules and regulations to be followed, but it's something which is complex and messy which needs to be interpreted. And therefore hermeneutics is a useful way of thinking about it. And then it wouldn't be right to not have a quote from Albert Einstein. If we knew what we were doing, it would not be called research, would it? Sadly, there's no evidence that he said that. However, the essence of it is quite good. The fact that if we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't be research. We're exploring new things, therefore it's research. Therefore, we're not quite sure what it is we're doing. I wish he said that, but he didn't. I did say, if I'd actually said all the things people claim I said, I would not have had time to do any research. Obviously, Einstein didn't say that either. I just made that one up completely as well. So if you are feeling confused, it's okay. It's not a problem. Don't worry. one thing which I'm just going to add this in because I found this only a few days ago when I was kind of reviewing this and thinking, oh, this is really interesting. This is from the Journal of Cell Science. This is hard science. This is full on science. Martin Schwartz said, the more comfortable we become with being stupid, the deeper we will wade into the unknown and the more unlikely we are to make big discoveries. To be clear, what he did, and I did read the paper, it was a bit confusing because it got into a lot of cell science, which I'm not an expert in at all. He's not saying relative stupidity, i.e., I'm stupid because I just haven't done the reading compared to other people. He's not talking about that. He's talking about the idea of pushing out of boundaries, pushing out of places where we're comfortable, which may be seen as being stupid, or certainly into areas of unknown not just to us, but unknown to other people as well, which is why research in terms of understanding what other artists are doing, understanding the context around you is an absolutely vital part of it. But then pushing out beyond or finding the gaps and saying there's a gap in between what other people have done, I'm going to go and fill that gap and make something in that space. It's that kind of stupidity rather than staying comfortable with where we are, but pushing out. Now, if they're saying that in cell science, biology, it would make sense that should be a place that we can and I think we should be comfortable in pursuing. So, some questions, which partly goes back to what you wrote before in silence. So some questions to think about again, and then I want you to do something with this in a second. The first question is, what have you done so far? Now you could read that in different ways, what have you done so far in your life? But let's focus it on this course, because you're here on this MA right now. So you think, well, I'm only in week 2, so I haven't done much. Think about it like this. I'm going to scare you slightly right now, so I'll warn you. This will be a little bit scary. To do a master's, the rough idea of a master's is that to complete it, you achieve 180 level 7 credits. To achieve 1 credit as a notional idea, we suggest, and this is a kind of across all kind of masters, it takes 10 hours of work to achieve 1 credit. That means to get 180 credits, it's 1,800 hours of work. That's not 1,800 hours of sitting in talks like this, but 1,800 hours of you working, making, reading, experimenting, testing, reflecting, doing all of this stuff, including being in sessions with other students, stuff like that. Now, if you spread that across the 2 years of the course, as you know, there are 60 weeks in the course. Blocks of terms of 10 weeks, 3 lots in the first year, 3 lots in the second year. If you divide 1,800 by 60, you get 30 hours. So 30 hours of work per week. So we're now Wednesday afternoon. You probably, if that's the case, you probably should have done about 45 hours work already. And if you work every week through the year, you can reduce that 30 to about 20 hours rather than just the term time. So maybe at this point you'd have done maybe 30 to 45 hours worth of work on your art, on your process and what you were doing for your masters. Now, I'm not expecting that would be the case necessarily at this early stage, and I'm not suggesting that you've done 45 hours in printmaking, making prints, or 45 hours in front of a computer making videos, or whatever it is that you're doing, or painting. It's what have you done so far in terms of thinking, reading, exploring, wondering, observing? One of the beauties of this, my wife thinks this is rather unfair, but you're sitting in the bath watching a tap drip, and I would say as an artist, you're working. Because you're observing. You're taking it in, you're thinking, look at that, the way the shape works, and it gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and the way it drops and the light changes as it comes down, My wife thinks I'm just shirking, really. But I think, so the question is what have you done so far? So think about it in terms of this week and a half. What are the things that you've done so far? You've been in sessions, you've met other students, you've maybe wandered to the library, maybe you've done an induction already. But those kind of things, what have you done so far? And it's a useful question to ask yourself on a regular basis, so that you're kind of the reflecting on action. This is another aside, but reflecting on action and setting up a regular discipline of doing that means actions happen. Because otherwise you reflect, you stop and say, right, maybe twice a week you're going to sit down and you're going to reflect on what you've done. I think, I haven't done anything. Oh dear. Guess what? Next time you'll embarrass yourself and you say, right, okay, next time I'll do something, so I've got something to reflect on. So the actual setting up of the discipline makes stuff happen at times. So asking yourself these questions are really quite useful to do. Even at the beginning, as you're kind of strengthening and learning and developing this muscle, as it were, of reflection. What have you discovered so far? And that's a kind of just an ongoing process. If we just said what have we discovered in the last 3 days, there'd be loads of things that we've kind of discovered. As artists, this is what goes on all the time. What will you change because of what you have discovered? So thinking through the steps, what have I done? What have I discovered? What will I then change because of what I've discovered? And then what will you do next because of that? So it's another way, don't worry, the questions are going to come back, but in another way it's that cycle. I haven't kind of tied them so closely to that, but in effect that's what's going on. By asking these questions, you're kind of pushing yourself deeper and deeper so that you're kind of moving forward and developing something further. So take a few minutes to do that. Now that might relate to the notes you made before when I asked you to think about what it is you make. So you might want to go back to that. So take 3 minutes, because I want to try and finish by 1:30. So we've got 6 minutes. So there's one more little thing I want to do. And then you can ask as many questions as you want after that, it's fine. But take 3 minutes to think through those questions. And then I'm going to ask you to do one more little thing. Okay, I know that's not a lot of time, but you've been very compliant in it. Most of you seem to have done what I've asked you to do, which is you don't have to do that. I'm going to ask you to do one more thing, but you don't have to do this. And I know there's possibly a couple of people who do have to run literally in 2 minutes if they need to go. Just go if you need to go. A powerful thing to do with something like this is not just to write it down, but to say it to somebody else. Because the actual verbalising it to somebody else puts it, almost kind of releases it into the world and kind of says this is something which is real. As well as you might say it to someone who might be able to check up and say to a couple of days later, did you do what you said you were going to do? And that's a powerful tool in itself, just kind of making it open and then somebody can check up on you. So what I suggest is the last couple of minutes, in twos, just the person next to you, tell them what you wrote. If you're comfortable and you want to do this, you don't have to. But tell them what you wrote, so that verbalising of it makes it into something more than just your internal ideas, even the stuff that's written down, but gives it life outside of you, and therefore kind of gives it potentially a power to come back and actually really impact on you, and it is something that you will go on and do. So if you're comfortable doing that, take the next 2 minutes to turn to the person next to you. Just do it in twos and tell each other what it is that you wrote, and particularly what your next plan is going to be, what you're going to do next. Just to say, carry on talking, just say that's the end, it's finished. You carry on talking if you want to. Next Wednesday we're in the lecture theatre at 2 o'clock. If you've got any questions, shout. Ask them now if you want, or if you want to come and talk to me afterwards, I'll be here for a bit. It is recorded. It probably will take me a little bit of time, so I'll edit out all the discussion bits. So I hope by the end of the week it'll be online if you need it. If not, we'll see you next Wednesday. Thank you.